Well, thank you all for being here. I'm excited to talk to you about Enemies in Love. And here's the beautiful cover, and these two people actually existed. Um, so the most common question I get is, how did you get this story? I mean, we're talking about an African-American woman who falls in love with a Nazi soldier in World War II. So it really came to be, I had a casual dinner conversation with my mom. This was years ago. And she shared with me that we're distant relatives of Colonel Charles Young. And he was the highest ranking African American in the US Army until his death in 1922. So I became intrigued and started reading about Blacks in the military because I was just fascinated when you think of that era of African Americans serving, fighting for liberties that they weren't yet afforded. So I just got my hands on whatever I could. And there was this one book called G.I. Nightingales. It was all about World War II, and I started gravitating towards that war in particular. There was this one chapter, and it was about Black women who served, and I didn't know this. Like, I knew they'd been in the volunteer corps, but I didn't know they were Army officers in World War II. And it mentioned this woman named Eleanor Powell, and it had one line that changed everything. It said, "The war had fond memories for Eleanor Powell, who met and later married her husband, a German prisoner of war in Arizona in World War II." And I'm like, Arizona? Nazi soldiers? Wait, stop. I've got to unpack this history because what I learned is not matching. So I embarked on this journey and started researching the era when we almost brought over, it's almost 400,000 German soldiers we captured in Europe and Northern Africa during the war and shipped them over and dispersed them in camps, almost 600 across the United States. And it was totally legal under the Geneva Convention. There was all this unskilled labor because the American men were gone, so you needed people to tend to the farms and the plants and the canneries, and you had German prisoners as your workforce. So the United States military really wasn't keen on Blacks serving at all. And so what were they going to do with this small unit of Black nurses who fought so hard just to get into the Corps? So they said, you know what, we're going to place you all either in segregated bases where there were Black soldiers, or we'll have them oversee the prisoners of war camp. And in Eleanor's unit in particular, her commanding officer told them, we're going to put you all in, replace a white unit because we're nervous of all the socializing and fraternization that's taking place with white nurses and the German soldiers. So we're going to put you Black women in. There won't be any problems. Like, this is where we were as a country. So if you can imagine, Jim Crow, and Arizona functioned completely under Jim Crow. It wasn't just the Deep South, as we all know, as we unpack a lot of U.S. history. Segregation was across the United States. And so these Black nurses in uniform, they would go into town, couldn't get served. And some people, well, they kind of made a concession. They would say, you can order, we'll bring the food around back. They would try to buy clothes, and the salesperson would tell them, you can hold it up to yourself, but you weren't allowed to try on clothes if you were Black. So this was this environment of humiliation and racism. And Eleanor in particular, when I was uncovering her story, it infuriated her. She was from Milton, Massachusetts, which is a progressive suburb outside of Boston. And even though Boston has its ugly racial history, Milton was entirely different. It was very progressive, and Eleanor grew up, embraced. Her family was very well, they were admired. It's an upper middle class white community. Those were her neighbors, those were her friends, those were her classmates. It wasn't until she decided to serve her country that she became really face to face with hardcore racism. So you can imagine just how humiliated she felt. So I started having flashbacks about my own childhood when I was writing this book. And although I've been in New York for 17 years, I consider myself a New Yorker. I'm born and raised in Dallas, Texas. Now, I had, for the most part, a wonderful childhood. But there were instances that I still remember to this day, and it made some slight parallels to what Eleanor went through. For example, I grew up in a neighborhood called Oak Cliff. And the closest thing I'll give you, maybe it's a little bit like Harlem. It started off as a white community. You had some really wealthy areas, some not so wealthy areas. But once blacks started moving in, the whites left, similar to what happens here in Harlem, right? So I grew up in Oak Cliff, really nice home, nice Hammers. We were all professionals, black community, but we went to school across town to a predominantly white elite private school. And in the third grade, I remember an art class, and I'll never forget it because I had these long pigtails and I had clips and I had little glasses. And I got into some argument. I don't know what it was about, but this one student, his name was Mahmoud, and he said, "You stupid nigger." And I panicked. I had never been called that before. I knew I had to do something, but I wasn't prepared. And I remember putting my head down. I just remember these clips hitting my face, and the whole table got quiet. We all knew that was a really bad word. And the teacher wasn't anywhere nearby. So in my mind, I didn't know anything about Mahmoud. I mean, when I looked at him visually, I guess the closest thing to him, I thought he was Native American. So I whipped up something, "Well, you shut up and get in your canoe." I didn't know what I was talking about. He was totally like Middle Eastern, but whatever. That was the best I could do under pressure. And so I remember when I got home that day and I was talking to my mom and dad, I started crying. I was so wounded. I was so embarrassed and humiliated. And I also felt no vindication slurring him. So at that moment, I realized in the third grade, I was going to have to figure out a way to stand up for myself without diminishing someone else and stooping to that level. I mean, I wasn't from a family or had a background where that's how you handled conflict. I was going to figure out a way to come up with something, some comeback where I can maintain my dignity, come from a position of strength, or walk away from a position of strength, but not defeat. So I learned that in the third grade. So that was a great lesson because we're not a hateful family. So I knew, okay, if anyone ever calls me that, I'm gonna have to punch them somehow, but I'm not gonna go into that hate speech. It's not who I was. But I also learned a couple of years, and I didn't have any more problems after that with students. But I learned what could happen when you have a teacher who says something hurtful. And I thought about some of the nurses in World War II, the ones at Eleanor, when she encountered officers in the Army who didn't invite them to certain socials, didn't ask them how they were doing, actually said hello to some of the German POWs without speaking to any of the nurses. But this is a different situation in that I was in the 5th grade, and I had this one teacher. We used to do drills, right, where you compete, like who could figure out the problem the fastest. And we had this one teacher who would crack up, okay, the winner of this one gets a trip to the Trinity River, which is the most disgusting polluted river in Dallas, right? He would do stuff like that. And then one time, so we did this one drill, and he said, okay, the winner gets a trip to Oak Cliff. Well, that's where I lived. And I thought to myself, well, wait a minute. What's wrong with my neighborhood? I mean, by then I was going on play dates. I mean, their houses were just like my houses. The only difference is we were in a black neighborhood. And that's when I learned, wow, gosh, there are adults who get this wrong, right? And so if I go back to Eleanor's story and these nurses, and when they were confronting these commanding officers in their own military who were like, I'm sorry, this officers club, it's whites only. You can't come in. I thought, wow, that must have really hurt. And it did. But in this case, she took solace in a man who fell in love with her, who happened to be a German, out of all people. So I had to learn about Frederick because obviously if you're reading about a Nazi soldier, this is someone I do not want to like at all. And it turned out he was conscripted. He wasn't in the Nazi party, never joined. He was drafted. And he was captured and sent to Arizona, and these two started a secret romance. And when you think about what they were up against, I mean, they were committing crimes on 2 levels. Jim Crow, Nazism, they're both from countries with racialized laws that forbid mixing of the races in any intimate way. And then she's an officer in the American Army, and he's in Hitler's army. So honestly, if they got caught, she could have been court-martialed. That could have been seen as colluding with the enemy. But they didn't care. They didn't care at all. And they kept up this romance. And I won't give it all away, of course, but I'll just say, something happened in 9 months. And yeah, so it got complicated. But the war ends, and these two reunite, and they start a life together, post-World War II. And they moved so many times in the United States. They tried even in Europe. And it's so hard for them to find a community that will accept them. But they don't give up. They just keep moving, or they stand up for themselves. They keep moving. They keep trying. They don't break. And in fact, they married in 1947. This is 20 years after Loving v. Virginia. And you really think about their courage. So they got married when several states in the United States still forbid mixed race marriages. But they kept pushing, and they ended up settling, believe it or not, this is what I thought was so crazy, just an hour and a half north of here in Connecticut, in this community called Village Creek. And it actually advertised as a prejudice-free zone. And they spent their lives there and were together more than 50 years. So there's a lot of history in this book, which I love, and as a black woman, I thought, wow, I knew about the Tuskegee Airmen, I knew about these black battalion units. I don't know about black nurses. And so I hope this book fills a huge gap about another group that's unfortunately been omitted from our history books. And I think about, honestly, tomorrow, that's all I've been thinking about is the election. Anyone can tell you I'm just kind of obsessed. But I'm encouraged when I think about where we should go as a country. I think about Eleanor and Frederick, and I think about people who stand up for themselves, stand up for what's right, and I'm motivated, I hope, and everyone else, to cast a ballot for people who feel the same way. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you.